All right, rascals, we are back. Happy Thursday. We are moving on from chapter 11.1. We're going to start 11.2 today. As this slide indicates, this title, or the title of this chapter, is Plantations and Slavery Spread. So if you look around this collage of images that I have on this slide, especially over on the left side, you might be able to tell just by looking at it what crop was partly responsible for the expansion of slavery in the United States. Well, let's find out. But first, some review from chapter 11.1. So just picking up where we left off, it's always a good strategy to go back and revisit some things before you start looking at new territory. So the Industrial Revolution is what we looked at in chapter 11.1. You guys are doing your research projects right now. I can't wait to see them. It refers to a series of economic changes beginning in the late 1700s. Well, what kind of changes, you might ask? Well, here's one. Manufacturing replaced farming as the main form of work in America. So new industries and inventions, the kind that you're researching right now, they changed how people worked and lived in the young United States. So we have factories and mills open, and the workers who were employed in those factories and mills began using new machines to increase production, meaning they're making more products or making the same product in larger quantities. But one invention really stands out from this era. It is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. When we say gin here, that is slang. It means engine, cotton engine, but we say cotton gin. The cotton gin transformed life in the southern United States. So for chapter 11.2 beginning now, this is what we're going to be learning today. We want you to be able to explain how cotton and the cotton gin led to the expansion of slavery in the South. All right, so we're going to talk right now. We're going to start with the cotton boom. So as the Industrial Revolution unfolded, the demand or the desire or need for American cotton grew around the world. More countries wanted American cotton, which would be processed in textile mills to make clothing and other goods. So a textile mill is a place where you process cotton to make fabrics and cloth and things like that, and maybe finished clothing. There are a lot of those textile factories in Britain. So American cotton growers, they wanted to meet that demand, because if they can fill that demand for this cotton in the other parts of the world, that means they're going to make a lot of money off of that. So in 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin was invented. And what this did was it allowed for an enormous increase in the production of cotton, meaning that these farmers now, these cotton growers, these plantation owners, if they have a cotton gin to use, they can increase their production by an incredible amount, which means they have more product to sell. So before the cotton gin was invented, a worker who worked in the cotton fields, they could clean 1 pound of cotton per day. Using the gin, however, a worker could clean 50 pounds per day. So this led to what we know as the cotton boom. So whenever time we're talking about something dealing with economics and we use the word boom, it means a period of growth or an era of growth. So the cotton gin resulted in a growth or a boom in the cotton industry. So I've linked a video right here for you guys. This is from PBS. It's about 3 minutes long. It's really interesting to watch because it talks about how you take cotton from the fields and process it and make it into other things. Just being from up here in Wisconsin, none of us up here have access to a cotton plantation or a cotton farm. So we don't really know what it looks like. So when we talk about cleaning cotton up here, basically there's a seed and a big cotton puff, I would call it. It's called a boll. And for you to be able to use the cotton boll, the fibers that you would turn into fabric, you have to get the seed out of there. But it's really, really difficult and time consuming. So that's why this machine was so important. All right. So cotton production increases. So between 1790 and 1860, that's 70 years. That's not really that much time. Cotton production increased 1,000-fold. So that means it went up 1,000 times. So to put that in perspective, if in 1790 you could produce 1 bale of cotton a year, 70 years later in 1860 you could produce 1,000 barrels, or you did. Plantation owners were getting rich off this cotton, filthy rich, but they needed lots of workers to tend their vast fields. The more cotton they could grow, the more money they would make. So where are they going to get these workers? Can they hire people and pay them a fair wage? No. Here's what they did. Slaves were used for cotton production. Slaves had been in the United States, or what's now the United States, since 1619. We just passed the 400-year anniversary of that. So growing numbers of slaves were used and abused to raise cotton for export and sale within the country. So let's look at some aspects of slavery in the South. So first, some numbers right here. So slaveholders with large plantations, these massive properties where they grew tons and tons of cotton, they were the people that owned those. They were the richest and most powerful people in the South. But there weren't that many of those large plantation owners. So to put this in perspective, only about a third of white families in the South owned slaves. And of the families who owned slaves, only 10% of those had plantations with 20 or more slaves. So you got to think, if you do the math there, it's about, I don't know, a little over 3% of white families had these properties that had 20 or more slaves on them. So that wasn't super common. There were more people that had smaller numbers of slaves, and the biggest group, or the biggest portion of the population, didn't have any slaves at all. All right, African Americans in the South. So by 1840, slaves made up 1/3 of the population of the South. And for all you rascals that remember when we were talking about the Constitution, you remember this important compromise when they were determining how the slave population would be counted for the purposes of representation in the government and Congress, and how states would be taxed. So you remember that slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person. Slaves were not viewed as human beings, but as the property of their masters, and they had no rights and suffered terribly under awful conditions. So here's a description of what maybe a day's work could be like if you were a slave in those days. So slaves were forced to begin work before sunrise. I know a lot of you guys would rather sleep in, but you didn't have a choice if you were a slave. They had to work in the brutally hot fields until the sun went down in the evening. Here's another kick in the pants for you. If there was a full moon, the extra light in the evening meant that they would often work long hours after sunset. Jeez. An overseer, that's another term for a supervisor, kept track of the work in the fields, and slaves were sometimes whipped or beaten or worse by their overseer. So you might ask, well, what was it like to be in a family if you were a slave? Well, here's some stuff for you. Slaves could marry each other, but their marriages were not recognized by the law. So, well, what does that mean? Here's an explanation for you. This means that a husband or wife could be sold away at any time and taken from their loved ones, often forever. So when people are married now, part of the vows say, "Till death do us part." When slaves married, the vow said, "Till death or distance do us part," knowing that death might separate them, but also if one of the married people, or one of the husband or wife, were removed from that by being sold. So death or distance do us part. It shows that slaves knew that they could be taken from their families with no choice in that matter. And children of slaves could be, and often were, taken from their families too. So chances were that a slave would never see their family again if they were sold to another slaveholder. Just terrible stuff. You might ask, well, didn't the slaves ever try to rise up against their slave owners? Well, yes, they did. Good question. I'm glad you asked. So since they had no legal rights, slaves didn't have many options for protesting the institution of slavery. One of the only ways of fighting back was through armed rebellion. So there have been slave revolts that had happened in the past, but the most famous one, or infamous one, or most notable one, maybe, was led by a man named Nat Turner in 1831. So took place in Virginia. Turner and a bunch of his followers rebelled, and they killed over 50 white slave owners and their families. They were eventually captured, and Nat Turner was hanged. White slave owners in the South were frightened by Nat Turner. They thought, well, if this could happen in Virginia, in this community, it could happen in our community, it could happen in North Carolina or Georgia or Mississippi. There was this fear that spread throughout slave owners in the South. So in response to this incident, hundreds of African Americans were killed, and more restrictions were put on slaves too. So we'll take a second to look at African American culture in the South as it developed in this era. So religion was very important in the African American culture in the South during this time. Slaves enjoyed and were often comforted by the stories from the Bible. Many songs popular with African Americans expressed a desire for freedom. These religious folk songs were called spirituals. and you might know some of them today. So I've included a link right here to a song called Go Down Moses. This is an old spiritual. It's been performed by many, many people over time. I used to think this song was called Let My People Go because that line is repeated throughout. But the actual title of the song is Go Down Moses. I encourage you all to go and give it a listen. It's pretty cool stuff. Uh, Take care. Stay strong.